The man who preached love and family, but killed them both. In the quiet suburban streets of Columbia, Illinois, there lived a family that seemed to embody everything the American dream promised. Christopher Coleman and his wife Sherry lived in a beautiful house, attended church regularly, and took smiling photos with their two young sons, Garrett, 11, and Gavin, 9. To their community, they appeared to be the perfect Christian family, elegant, happy, and always together. Christopher traveled the world alongside famous preacher Joyce Meyer, speaking about faith, restoration, family, and love. From the pulpit and on social media, he presented himself as a loving husband, a dedicated father, and a Christian man above any suspicion. His messages about family values and marital commitment resonated with thousands of believers who saw him as a role model for Christian living. But behind this carefully crafted facade lay a web of lies so intricate and deceptive that when the truth finally emerged, it would shock a community and destroy the lives of everyone who had believed in the image Christopher had so meticulously constructed. On the morning of May 5, 2009, the perfect family image would be shattered forever when police discovered one of the most devastating crime scenes in the city's history. Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman were found dead in their home, victims of a brutal murder that would initially appear to be the work of a religious extremist seeking to silence Christopher's ministry. But as investigators dug deeper into the evidence, they would uncover a truth far more sinister than any external threat. The loving husband and father who had preached about family values had methodically planned and executed the murder of his own wife and children. The man who spoke eloquently about love and commitment had chosen murder over divorce, believing that killing his family was preferable to damaging his reputation. This is the story of Christopher Coleman, a man who used his faith as a mask to hide his true nature, who manipulated an entire community's trust, and who ultimately revealed that the greatest threats to a family can come from within. It's a story about the dangerous gap between public persona and private reality, and about how the very institutions meant to protect and nurture families can sometimes harbor their greatest destroyers. If you think you understand the depths of deception a person can achieve, you're about to discover that some masks are so perfect they can fool everyone until the moment they finally slip, the perfect image. Christopher Coleman had spent years crafting an image of himself as the ideal Christian husband and father. Born and raised in a devout Christian family, he had always understood the power of appearance and the importance of maintaining a spotless reputation within religious communities. By the time he married Sherry in 1997, he had already begun building the persona that would define his public life for the next 12 years. The Coleman family lived in a spacious home in Columbia, Illinois, a quiet suburb where neighbors knew each other by name and children played safely in tree-lined streets. Christopher worked as head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, one of the largest Christian organizations in the United States, a position that gave him significant status within the religious community and required him to travel extensively with the famous preacher. Sherry Coleman was everything a pastor's wife was expected to be: supportive, devoted, and completely dedicated to her family and faith. She homeschooled their two sons, Garrett and Gavin, participated actively in church activities, and maintained the household while Christopher traveled for his ministry work. Friends and neighbors consistently described her as kind, gentle, and deeply committed to her role as a wife and mother. The Coleman boys were well-behaved, academically successful, and actively involved in church youth programs. Garrett, at 11, was showing signs of leadership and had expressed interest in following his father's path in ministry. 9-year-old Gavin was artistic and sensitive, beloved by teachers and church members for his sweet nature and creative talents. From the outside, the Colemans appeared to be living proof that Christian family values could create happiness and stability. Christopher frequently spoke at church events about the importance of marriage, the sanctity of family, and the role of faith in building strong relationships. His messages were compelling and heartfelt, delivered with the conviction of someone who seemed to be living the principles he preached. Christopher was someone we all looked up to, recalled Pastor Mike Johnson from their local church. He spoke about marriage and family with such passion and authenticity. He seemed to have figured out how to balance a demanding career with being a devoted husband and father. We thought he was the real deal. Social media posts from the Coleman family painted a picture of domestic bliss. Photos showed family vacations, birthday celebrations, and quiet moments at home. Christopher's captions often included Bible verses about family and expressions of gratitude for his beautiful wife and amazing sons. The posts received hundreds of likes and comments from friends and followers who admired what appeared to be a genuinely happy family. But even as Christopher maintained this perfect image, cracks were beginning to appear in the foundation of his carefully constructed life. The demands of his career, the pressure of maintaining his reputation, and his own hidden desires were creating tensions that would eventually explode in the most devastating way possible. What the community didn't know was that Christopher had begun to view his family not as a blessing to be cherished, but as an obstacle to be overcome. The very image of perfection that had brought him status and admiration was becoming a prison that he was desperate to escape, and he was beginning to consider options that no loving husband and father should ever contemplate. The hidden life. While Christopher Coleman preached about marital fidelity and family commitment from church pulpits across the country, he was living a double life that contradicted everything he claimed to believe. Behind the facade of the devoted husband was a man who had been conducting a secret affair with Tara Lintz, a childhood friend who had reconnected with him through social media. The affair had begun innocuously enough, casual messages between old friends, reminiscences about their shared past, and gradually increasing personal conversations. But what started as friendly communication had evolved into something much more serious, with Christopher expressing dissatisfaction with his marriage and fantasizing about a different life with Tara. Christopher's messages to Tara revealed a man who felt trapped by the very image he had worked so hard to create. He complained about feeling suffocated by family responsibilities, frustrated by Sherry's devotion to their children, and resentful of the expectations that came with his position in the ministry. He painted himself as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own situation. "I feel like I'm living someone else's life," he wrote to Tara in one message. "Every day I have to pretend to be this perfect Christian husband and father, but inside I'm dying. I want to be with you, to start over, to finally be happy." Tara, who was divorced and working as a fitness instructor in Florida, was initially hesitant to become involved with a married man. But Christopher was persistent and persuasive, using his skills as a speaker to convince her that their relationship was somehow ordained by God, that his marriage to Sherry had been a mistake that needed to be corrected. As the affair intensified, Christopher began making promises to Tara about their future together. He spoke about leaving his wife, about starting a new life in Florida, about finally being free to pursue his own happiness. But there was one significant problem with these plans. Divorce would destroy everything Christopher had worked to build. In the conservative Christian circles where Christopher moved, divorce was not just frowned upon, it was career-ending. A divorced man could not maintain his position with Joyce Meyer Ministries, could not continue speaking at churches about family values, could not preserve the reputation and status that had become central to his identity. Divorce would mean financial ruin, professional disgrace, and social exile from the community that had elevated him to prominence. Christopher found himself caught between two incompatible desires. He wanted to be with Tara, but he also wanted to maintain his position and reputation. The solution he began to contemplate was as shocking as it was calculated. If he couldn't divorce his wife without destroying his career, perhaps there was another way to free himself from his marriage. The idea of murdering his family didn't come to Christopher in a moment of rage or passion. Instead, it developed gradually as he weighed his options and concluded that killing Sherry and the boys would be preferable to the professional and financial consequences of divorce. In his twisted logic, becoming a widower would generate sympathy rather than condemnation, would preserve his ministry career, and would allow him to eventually marry Tara without damaging his reputation. As Christopher began to seriously consider murder as a solution to his problems, he started laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most elaborate and cold-blooded crimes in Illinois history. The man who preached about love and family was about to reveal the depths of his capacity for evil. The mysterious threats. In the months leading up to the murders, Christopher Coleman began implementing a plan that was as methodical as it was diabolical. Understanding that he needed to create a plausible alternative explanation for his family's deaths, he started manufacturing evidence of an external threat that would deflect suspicion away from himself. The first mysterious message appeared in November 2008, 6 months before the murders. Christopher reported to police that he had received a threatening email warning him to stop his ministry work or face consequences. The message, which appeared to come from a religious extremist, contained specific threats against his family and demanded that he resign from his position with Joyce Meyer Ministries. "Your false teachings will not be tolerated," read one of the messages Christopher claimed to have received. "Stop spreading your lies, or your family will pay the price. This is your only warning." Christopher played the role of the concerned husband and father perfectly. He contacted police, expressed fear for his family's safety, and asked for advice on how to protect his wife and children. He seemed genuinely worried, consulting with security experts and even considering hiring bodyguards for his family. The threatening messages continued over the following months, escalating in both frequency and severity. Christopher reported receiving emails, letters, and even phone calls from someone who seemed obsessed with destroying his ministry and harming his family. Each incident was carefully documented and reported to police, building a paper trail that would supposedly explain the eventual murders. Detective Justin Barlow, who was assigned to investigate the threats, found Christopher to be a credible and cooperative witness. He seemed like a genuinely concerned father who was trying to protect his family from a dangerous stalker, Barlow would later recall. He provided us with copies of all the messages, answered all our questions, and followed our advice about security measures. There was no reason to suspect he was lying. But what investigators didn't know was that Christopher was the author of every threatening message. Using public computers and anonymous email accounts, he had created an elaborate fiction designed to provide cover for the murders he was planning. The messages were carefully crafted to suggest the work of a religious fanatic who viewed Christopher's ministry as heretical and dangerous. The threats served multiple purposes in Christopher's plan. They established a motive for someone else to kill his family. They demonstrated his apparent concern for their safety, and they provided a timeline that would make the eventual murders seem like the culmination of a long-standing threat rather than a sudden act of domestic violence. As the threatening messages continued, Christopher began sharing his fears with friends and colleagues, further reinforcing the narrative he was creating. He spoke about the stress of living under threat, the difficulty of maintaining his ministry work while worrying about his family's safety, and his determination to protect his wife and children at all costs. Chris was really struggling with those threats, remembered Sarah Mitchell, a colleague at Joyce Meyer Ministries. He was torn between his commitment to the ministry and his responsibility to keep his family safe. We all admired how he was handling such a difficult situation. The final threatening message arrived just days before the murders, warning Christopher that time was running out and that his family would soon pay for his refusal to abandon his ministry. The message was more specific than previous threats, mentioning details about the Coleman family's daily routines that suggested the sender had been watching them closely. With this final piece of his elaborate deception in place, Christopher was ready to execute the plan he had been developing for months. The man who had spent his career speaking about faith and family was about to commit the ultimate betrayal of both, all while maintaining the facade of a loving husband and father until the very end. The morning of the crime. And May 5th, 2009, began like any other day in the Coleman household, with Christopher following his usual morning routine of preparing for a workout at the gym. At 5:30 a.m., he kissed his sleeping wife goodbye and left the house, telling Sherry he would be back in a couple of hours. It was a scene that had played out hundreds of times before, the devoted husband maintaining his fitness routine despite his busy travel schedule. But this morning was different. Instead of going to the gym, as he claimed, Christopher drove to a secluded area where he disposed of evidence he had prepared for the murders. He had spent weeks planning every detail of this day, from the timing of his departure to the creation of an alibi that would place him far from the house when the bodies were discovered. At approximately 5:30 a.m., while Christopher was supposedly at the gym, the real horror was taking place in the Coleman home. Using his knowledge of the house's layout and his family's sleeping patterns, Christopher had returned through a basement entrance and made his way upstairs to where his wife and children lay sleeping. The murders were carried out with a cold efficiency that spoke to Christopher's methodical planning. Sherry was strangled in her bed, likely while she slept, giving her no opportunity to defend herself or call for help. The boys were killed in their respective bedrooms, their young lives ended by the man they trusted most in the world. After killing his family, Christopher took time to stage the crime scene to support his narrative of an external threat. Using red spray paint he had purchased weeks earlier, he wrote threatening messages on the walls, including, "You can't stop me," and "punished," designed to look like the work of the religious extremist he had been impersonating in his threatening messages. The staging was elaborate and carefully planned. Christopher arranged the bodies to suggest a struggle, scattered personal items to indicate a break-in, and left other evidence that would support the theory that his family had been killed by the mysterious stalker who had been threatening them for months. At 6:47 a.m., Christopher called his neighbor Joe Tutko, claiming that he had been trying to reach his family but couldn't get through. He expressed concern that something might be wrong and asked Tutko to check on the house. This call was crucial to Christopher's alibi, as it established a timeline that would supposedly place him at the gym when the murders occurred. Chris sounded really worried on the phone, Tutko would later testify. He said he'd been calling the house, but no one was answering, and he was afraid something had happened. He asked me to go over and check on Sherry and the boys. When Tutko arrived at the Coleman house and found the front door unlocked, he discovered a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The bodies of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman were found in their bedrooms, and the threatening messages on the walls suggested that the family had been killed by someone with a grudge against Christopher's ministry. The initial response from law enforcement treated the scene as the work of an external perpetrator. The threatening messages Christopher had been reporting for months seemed to provide a clear motive, and his apparent alibi placed him away from the house during the time of the murders. For several hours, Christopher was viewed as a grieving widower rather than a suspect. But even as Christopher played the role of the devastated husband and father, investigators were beginning to notice inconsistencies in his story and evidence that would eventually expose the truth about what had really happened in the Coleman home that morning. The investigation Detective Justin Barlow arrived at the Coleman crime scene, expecting to investigate the culmination of the threatening campaign that had been targeting the family for months. The staged evidence initially supported the theory that Christopher's family had been killed by the religious extremist who had been sending threatening messages, but experienced investigators know that first impressions can be deceiving. As the investigation progressed, several inconsistencies began to emerge that cast doubt on Christopher's version of events. The first red flag was the lack of forced entry into the house. While Christopher claimed that his family had been killed by an intruder, there was no evidence that anyone had broken into the home. All doors and windows were secure, with no signs of tampering or damage. The second major inconsistency involved Christopher's alibi. He claimed to have been at the gym during the time of the murders, but security cameras at the fitness center showed no record of his presence that morning. When confronted with this discrepancy, Christopher claimed that he had actually gone for a run in a nearby park. But again, there was no evidence to support this revised story. Detective Barlow also noticed Christopher's unusual behavior during the initial interviews. While most people in his situation would be overwhelmed with grief and shock, Christopher seemed remarkably composed and focused on controlling the narrative of what had happened. He repeatedly emphasized the threatening messages he had been receiving and suggested specific lines of investigation for police to pursue. Something felt off about his demeanor, Detective Barlow later explained. He was certainly upset, but it seemed more like the upset of someone whose plan wasn't working rather than someone who had just lost his entire family. He was too focused on directing our investigation rather than grieving his losses. The investigation took a significant turn when forensic experts analyzed the threatening messages that had been written on the walls of the Coleman home. Handwriting analysis revealed that the messages bore striking similarities to Christopher's own writing style, and paint residue found on his clothing matched the spray paint used to write the messages. Even more damaging was the discovery of Christopher's cell phone records, which showed that he had been in contact with Tara Lintz on the morning of the murders. The timing of these communications contradicted his claims about his whereabouts and suggested that he had been coordinating with his mistress while his family lay dead in their home. When investigators examined Christopher's computer and email accounts, they uncovered the full extent of his affair with Tara and his plans to start a new life with her. The electronic evidence showed that Christopher had been promising Tara that they would soon be together permanently, with messages sent just days before the murders indicating that their reunion was imminent. Perhaps most damning was the discovery that Christopher had been researching methods of murder and ways to stage crime scenes to deflect suspicion. His internet search history revealed queries about strangulation techniques, the effectiveness of various staging methods, and how long it would take for bodies to be discovered in different circumstances. The threatening messages that had formed the foundation of Christopher's defense also came under scrutiny. Digital forensics experts traced the emails back to computers that Christopher had access to, and analysis of the writing style and content revealed patterns consistent with his other communications. The entire threatening campaign had been an elaborate fiction created by Christopher to provide cover for his planned murders. As the evidence mounted against him, Christopher's carefully constructed alibi began to crumble. Witnesses who had initially supported his story began to recant their statements when confronted with contradictory evidence, and the timeline of events that Christopher had provided proved to be impossible when subjected to detailed analysis. The arrest. On May 20th, 2009, 15 days after the murders of his wife and children, Christopher Coleman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest came after investigators had assembled overwhelming evidence that contradicted every aspect of Christopher's story and pointed conclusively to his guilt. The arrest took place at Christopher's mother's house, where he had been staying since the murders, while supposedly grieving the loss of his family. When Detective Barlow and his team arrived with the arrest warrant, Christopher showed the same eerie composure that had characterized his behavior throughout the investigation. "Christopher Coleman, you're under arrest for the murders of Sherry Coleman, Garrett Coleman, and Gavin Coleman," Detective Barlow announced as he placed the handcuffs on the man who had fooled so many people for so long. Christopher's response was minimal and controlled. He didn't protest his innocence, didn't express shock or outrage, and didn't ask for explanations. Instead, he simply nodded and allowed himself to be led away, as if he had been expecting this moment and had already resigned himself to its inevitability. The arrest sent shockwaves through the religious community that had embraced Christopher as a role model and leader. Joyce Meyer Ministries immediately suspended him from his position and issued a statement expressing their horror at the charges and their commitment to cooperating with the investigation. "We are devastated by these allegations," the ministry's statement read. "Christopher Coleman was a trusted member of our team, and we are struggling to reconcile these charges with the man we thought we knew. Our prayers are with the victims and their families during this difficult time." The reaction from the Coleman family's church and community was equally stunned. People who had admired Christopher's apparent devotion to his family and his eloquent speeches about Christian values found it impossible to believe that he could be capable of such horrific crimes. "It just doesn't make sense," said one church member who had known the family for years. "Chris was always talking about how much he loved Sherry and the boys. He seemed like the perfect husband and father. How could someone who preached about family values do something like this to his own family?" But as details of the investigation became public, the extent of Christopher's deception began to emerge. The affair with Tara Lintz, the manufactured threatening messages, the elaborate staging of the crime scene, all of it painted a picture of a man who had been living a lie for months while planning the murder of his own family. The arrest also revealed the full scope of Christopher's manipulation of those around him. Friends, colleagues, and family members who had supported him and believed his story felt betrayed and used, realizing that they had been unwitting participants in his deception. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the reaction of Sherry Coleman's family, who had initially supported Christopher and believed that he was as much a victim as they were. The revelation that he had killed their daughter and grandchildren was devastating beyond comprehension. "We trusted him," said Sherry's mother in a statement to the press. "We believed he loved our daughter and those beautiful boys. To learn that he murdered them in cold blood, that he looked us in the eye and lied to us while their bodies were still warm, it's beyond evil. It's beyond anything we could have imagined." As Christopher sat in his jail cell awaiting trial, the perfect image he had spent years constructing lay in ruins. The man who had preached about love and family had revealed himself to be capable of the ultimate betrayal, and the community that had once admired him was left to grapple with the reality that they had been deceived by a master manipulator. The trial. The trial of Christopher Coleman began on April 28, 2011, nearly 2 years after the murders that had shocked the community and destroyed the illusion of the perfect Christian family. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, family members, and community members who had followed the case since the beginning, all seeking answers to the question of how a man who preached about family values could murder his own wife and children. The prosecution, led by State's Attorney Chris Wrights, faced the challenge of proving that Christopher had methodically planned and executed the murders of his family while maintaining his facade as a loving husband and father. The evidence was overwhelming, but the defense team was prepared to argue that the case against Christopher was circumstantial and that the real killer had never been found. Christopher Coleman lived a lie, Wrights argued in his opening statement. He preached about family values while conducting an affair. He spoke about love and commitment while planning to murder his wife and children. He created an elaborate fiction about threats from a religious extremist to cover his tracks, but the evidence will show that he was the only person with motive, means, and opportunity to commit these horrific crimes. The prosecution presented a comprehensive case that included forensic evidence, digital communications, and witness testimony that systematically dismantled every aspect of Christopher's alibi. They showed that the threatening messages had been sent from computers Christopher had access to, that his cell phone records contradicted his claims about his whereabouts, and that his affair with Tara Lintz provided a clear motive for wanting his family dead. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence was a series of text messages between Christopher and Tara sent in the days leading up to the murders. In these messages, Christopher had promised that they would soon be together permanently and that nothing would stand in the way of their relationship. The timing and content of these messages made it clear that Christopher had been planning the murders well in advance. The defense, led by attorney William Margulis, attempted to argue that the evidence against Christopher was circumstantial and that the real killer was the mysterious stalker who had been threatening the family. They suggested that the investigation had focused too quickly on Christopher and had failed to pursue other leads that might have led to the real perpetrator. The prosecution wants you to believe that Christopher Coleman murdered his own family in cold blood, Margulis argued. But where is the direct evidence? Where are the witnesses who saw him commit these crimes? The prosecution's case is built on speculation and circumstantial evidence, not on facts. However, the defense's arguments were undermined by the overwhelming weight of the evidence against Christopher. Forensic experts testified about the handwriting analysis that linked him to the threatening messages. Digital forensic specialists explained how the electronic evidence contradicted his alibi, and investigators detailed the inconsistencies in his story that had first raised their suspicions. Perhaps the most compelling testimony came from Tara Lintz herself, who had been granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation with the prosecution. She described her affair with Christopher, his promises about their future together, and his assurances that his marriage would soon be over. Her testimony provided crucial insight into Christopher's state of mind in the weeks leading up to the murders. "He told me that he was going to be free soon," Tara testified, her voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "He said that within a few weeks we would be able to be together without any obstacles. When I asked him what he meant, he just said that I needed to trust him and that everything would work out." The prosecution also presented evidence of Christopher's internet searches in the weeks before the murders, which included queries about strangulation techniques, crime scene staging, and how to avoid detection when committing murder. These searches provided clear evidence of premeditation and planning that contradicted any claim that the murders had been committed by an external perpetrator. Throughout the trial, Christopher maintained his composure and showed little emotion, even when graphic evidence about his family's deaths was presented. His lack of visible grief or remorse was noted by observers and seemed to reinforce the prosecution's portrayal of him as a cold and calculating killer. The verdict. After deliberating for just over 4 hours, the jury returned a verdict that brought justice for Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman, while confirming what investigators had suspected from the early days of the investigation. On May 5, 2011, exactly 2 years after the murders, Christopher Coleman was found guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict was read in a courtroom filled with family members, friends, and community members who had been following the case since the beginning. As the word "guilty" was repeated 3 times, many in the courtroom wept for the victims who would never see justice served, but whose memories had finally been honored. Christopher's reaction to the verdict was consistent with his behavior throughout the trial and investigation. He showed no visible emotion, no surprise, and no remorse. He sat quietly as the verdict was read, staring straight ahead as if the proceedings were happening to someone else. Judge Milton Wharton, who had presided over the trial, scheduled the sentencing hearing for the following week. Under Illinois law, the conviction for 3 counts of first-degree murder carried a potential sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, and the prosecution was seeking the maximum penalty. The families of the victims expressed relief that justice had been served, but also acknowledged that no verdict could bring back their loved ones or heal the wounds that Christopher's actions had inflicted. "We're grateful that the jury saw through his lies and recognized him for what he really is," said Sherry's mother, Angela DeSico. "But no amount of justice can bring back our beautiful daughter and those precious boys. Christopher stole them from us forever, and we'll never understand how someone could do that to their own family." The sentencing hearing on May 12, 2011, provided an opportunity for family members to address Christopher directly, and for the judge to impose a sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes. The courtroom was again packed with people who had been touched by the case and wanted to see its conclusion. During the victim impact statements, family members spoke about the devastating loss of Sherry, Garrett and Gavin, and about the additional trauma of learning that their deaths had been caused by the person who was supposed to protect them most. "Christopher didn't just kill 3 people," said Ron Coleman, Sherry's father. "He killed a loving mother, 2 innocent children, and the trust of everyone who believed in him. He destroyed our family and our faith in the goodness of people. The man we thought we knew never existed. He was just a mask worn by a monster." When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Christopher declined to speak. He offered no apology, no explanation, and no expression of remorse for his actions. His silence spoke volumes about his character and his complete lack of empathy for the victims of his crimes. Judge Wharton sentenced Christopher Coleman to life in prison without the possibility of parole for each count of murder, with the sentences to run consecutively. The judge's comments during sentencing reflected the community's horror at Christopher's crimes and his betrayal of everything he had claimed to represent. "Mr. Coleman, you have been convicted of the most heinous crimes imaginable," Judge Wharton said. "You murdered your own wife and children in cold blood, then attempted to cover your tracks with an elaborate web of lies. You violated every trust, betrayed every relationship, and destroyed innocent lives for your own selfish purposes. You will spend the rest of your life in prison, and that is exactly what you deserve." The aftermath. The conviction and sentencing of Christopher Coleman marked the end of the legal proceedings, but the beginning of a long and difficult process of healing for the families and community members whose lives had been shattered by his crimes. The revelation that a respected religious leader had murdered his own family raised uncomfortable questions about trust, faith, and the ability to truly know another person. Joyce Meyer. Ministries where Christopher had worked for years and built his reputation as a devoted family man, was forced to grapple with the reality that they had employed a murderer who had used his position to enhance his credibility and cover his crimes. The organization implemented new background check procedures and counseling services for employees who had been traumatized by the revelation of Christopher's true nature. "We are heartbroken that someone we trusted could be capable of such evil," Joyce Meyer said in a statement after the conviction. "We pray for the victims and their families, and we are committed to learning from this tragedy to prevent anything like it from happening again." The church community that had embraced Christopher as a role model struggled to understand how they had been so completely deceived. Many members questioned their own judgment and wondered what signs they might have missed that could have prevented the tragedy. "It makes you question everything you think you know about people," said one church member who had known the Coleman family for years. "If Christopher could fool us so completely, how can we ever trust anyone again? It's shaken our faith not just in him, but in our ability to recognize good from evil." The case also had a profound impact on the broader discussion about domestic violence and the warning signs that family and friends should watch for. Mental health professionals and law enforcement experts use Christopher's case as an example of how abusers can maintain perfect public facades while planning violence against their families. The Coleman case shows us that domestic violence can hide behind any facade, explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, a psychologist who specializes in family violence. Christopher was able to maintain his image as a loving husband and father right up until the moment he killed his family. It reminds us that we need to look beyond appearances and trust our instincts when something feels wrong. The families of the victims established memorial funds in honor of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman, focusing on supporting other families affected by domestic violence and promoting awareness of the warning signs of abuse. The funds have provided counseling services, legal assistance, and emergency shelter for families trying to escape dangerous situations. Christopher Coleman was transferred to Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, where he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Even in prison, he has maintained his innocence and shown no remorse for his crimes. Prison officials report that he has adapted well to institutional life and has shown no signs of the violent behavior that characterized his crimes. The case continues to be studied by law enforcement professionals, psychologists, and criminologists who are interested in understanding how someone can maintain such an elaborate deception while planning and executing the murder of their own family. Christopher's ability to fool so many people for so long has made his case a textbook example of the dangers of trusting appearances over evidence. Reflective conclusion. The case of Christopher Coleman forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the masks it can wear. Here was a man who spent years preaching about family values, love, and commitment, while secretly planning to murder his own wife and children. His ability to maintain this deception while working in religious ministry and speaking to thousands of people about faith and family reveals the terrifying extent to which some individuals can compartmentalize their lives. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that Christopher's crimes were not committed in a moment of passion or rage, but were the result of months of careful planning and calculation. He methodically created the threatening messages that would provide cover for his crimes, researched murder techniques, and maintained his affair while presenting himself as a devoted husband and father. The level of premeditation involved in his crimes makes them particularly heinous and unforgivable. The case also highlights the devastating impact that domestic violence can have not just on immediate victims, but on entire communities. Christopher's crimes didn't just end 3 innocent lives. They shattered the faith and trust of everyone who had believed in him and looked up to him as a role model. The ripple effects of his deception continue to affect people who had considered him a friend, colleague, and spiritual leader. For the families of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman, the pain of loss has been compounded by the betrayal of discovering that their loved ones were killed by someone they trusted completely. For the families of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman, the pain of loss has been compounded by the betrayal of discovering that their loved ones were killed by someone they trusted completely. The knowledge that Christopher looked them in the eye and accepted their comfort, while knowing that he had murdered their daughter and grandchildren, adds an additional layer of trauma that will never fully heal. The case serves as a reminder that the greatest threats to families often come from within, and that the people we trust most can sometimes be the most dangerous. Christopher's ability to maintain his facade while planning murder shows us that evil can hide behind the most convincing masks, and that we must always remain vigilant for signs of deception and manipulation. Most importantly, the Coleman case demonstrates the importance of looking beyond appearances and trusting evidence over image. Christopher's reputation, his position in the ministry, and his apparent devotion to his family all served to deflect suspicion and provide cover for his crimes. It was only when investigators looked past his carefully constructed persona and examined the facts that his true nature was revealed. Investigators looked past his carefully constructed persona and examined the facts that his true nature was revealed. The man who preached love and family while planning their destruction serves as a chilling reminder that some people are capable of the most profound evil while maintaining the most convincing facades. Christopher Coleman's legacy is not the ministry work he claimed to value, but the 3 innocent lives he destroyed and the countless others he damaged through his deception and betrayal. The man who preached love and family while planning their destruction serves as a chilling reminder that some people are capable of the most profound evil while maintaining the most convincing facades. Christopher Coleman's legacy is not the ministry work he claimed to value, but the 3 innocent lives he destroyed and the countless others he damaged through his deception and betrayal. In the end, Christopher Coleman's story is a tragedy that could have been prevented if the warning signs had been recognized and acted upon. His case continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust and the importance of remaining vigilant for signs of deception, even in those we consider above suspicion. In the end, Christopher Coleman's story is a tragedy that could have been prevented if the warning signs had been recognized and acted upon. His case continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust and the importance of remaining vigilant for signs of deception, even in those we consider above suspicion. The perfect family that Christopher Coleman presented to the world never existed. It was always a carefully constructed lie designed to hide his true nature and provide cover for his ultimate crime. The real tragedy is that Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman paid the ultimate price for their husband and father's deception. Their lives ended by the very person who was supposed to protect them most. The perfect family that Christopher Coleman presented to the world never existed. It was always a carefully constructed lie designed to hide his true nature and provide cover for his ultimate crime. The real tragedy is that Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman paid the ultimate price for their husband and father's deception. Their lives ended by the very person who was supposed to protect them most. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel to learn about other cases that explore the dangerous gap between public persona and private reality, and the devastating consequences when trust is betrayed by those we love most.